In the last part of this lesson, we're going to talk about barbarians. Now, it's well known that barbarians can be invaders of civilizations. The term barbarian invasion is almost a cliché. And they can be anything from peaceful immigrants to violent conquerors. So let's write that up. And even when barbarians are veering more towards the conquest end of the spectrum, they're not necessarily destructive. They can restore order to a civilization. So, for example, the Franks, the Visigoths, and other Germanic barbarian groups that invaded the Roman Empire when it was collapsing did restore order to parts of the empire where the Roman army had long lost control. And they can also renew the vigour of a civilization. So, for example, when the Mongols invaded and conquered China, they established the Yuan dynasty, which was a time of cultural flourishing. Now, let's put up some notable barbarian invasions and have a look at some patterns. Okay, so here is a chart due to the author Brian Griffith in a book called The Gardens of Their Dreams. The terminology and the dates and so on are not necessarily entirely up to date, but it's just give us an impression of some patterns in the barbarian invasions. So here we've got in East Asia, so China, there was the 5 barbarian groups who invaded in the first millennium AD. Then the Mongols in the second millennium AD. You can see the Mongols were also active in South Asia and the Middle East. So in India, South Asia, they established the Mughal dynasty, for example. The South Asia also experienced the invasion of the Arabs, so the Islamic conquest, which affected not only India but also Egypt and North Africa. And also in India earlier in the first millennium were the Ethelites, similar to the Huns group, related to the Huns. And it's also thought these, as I think we've discussed in a previous part of this lesson, the Huns were possibly related to some of the barbarians invading China as well. So we can see the kind of global extent of these invasions. The barbarian invaders push out in many directions. In Egypt, that we have the Hyksos people who conquered northern Egypt and established a dynasty there in the middle of the second millennium BC, and then later the Sea Peoples. Both of these groups are rather mysterious. The Sea Peoples seem to be more like raiders than the Hyksos were. They sort of conquered Egypt, but these more raided Egypt, failed to establish any kind of government in Egypt, but caused a lot of troubles, all not just in Egypt but all around the Middle East. In fact, many cities were sacked and societies collapsed at that time. We've already said the Egyptians were conquered by the Arabs as part of the Islamic expansion. In North Africa, as well as the Arabs who we've already mentioned, there are also the Vandals. So at the time that the barbarians were invading the Roman Empire, so North Africa was at that time part of the Roman Empire. The Vandals came down through Spain and then crossed into North Africa. And now looking at Europe, this early part is a somewhat confused picture, but there seem to be several groups coming in over the course of a millennium or so. The Kurgan people, as it's written here, and the Indo-Europeans, bringing in cultural elements like the horse and the wheel, and their language, of course. And then later, around the end of the second millennium, the Dorians, the people who traditionally believed to have established the later Greek civilization after the collapse of the Minoan and Mycenaean people. And then later still into Europe, the Huns coming from the east, and the Franks and Goths coming from Germanic or Scandinavian areas, crossing the Rhine into the Roman Empire and establishing their rule in what's today France and Spain for the Goths, Spain and Italy briefly. Okay, and what we see then is that barbarian invasions seem to come in sort of temporally in waves, and particularly they seem to be associated with periods of global transformation. So Carol Quigley points out as kind of waves of barbarian invasion, firstly at the Middle Bronze Age, turning from the early Bronze Age into the Middle Bronze Age, and also at the transition from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. So both those kind of periods of wide cultural change across the old world were associated with waves of invasion. And let's just draw up his table that illustrates that. Okay, so here is Carol Quigley's table broken down into Central Europe, Italy, Greece, etc. And the early Bronze Age to Middle Bronze Age transition and the late Bronze Age to Iron Age transition. And we don't need to go into the details, but the point being that at both these times there seems to be a concentration of barbarian invaders in all these different regions. Not exactly simultaneous. Here they vary from about 1600 up to 2000 BC, but having similar sort of transformative effects. And similarly over here, the late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition around about the same time, particularly here in the ancient Near East, all around the year 1200 BC, the time of massive social change, collapse and recovery, leading into Dark Ages, out of which the Iron Age societies later emerged. Order was eventually restored. There's some overlap here, though some also using different terminology. And we can see from this table that there also seems to have been concentrations of barbarian invasions around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. So that was a time of big changes both in the west and east of Eurasia, and then again associated with the medieval to modern transition, particularly with the Mongols, but also the Turks coming into the Middle East. Now let's consider the motives of the barbarians. Why do barbarians invade, apart from for the sheer hell of it? Well, we can say that it's two main reasons. It's for wealth and opportunity. So they see that the people in the civilized areas are more prosperous and there are more opportunities for advancement there compared to the simple subsistence life of the barbarian areas. And the theorist W.J. Perry points out that people have often explained these barbarian invasions in terms of climate change, drying of the steppe areas, the Central Asian plains, that force people to move in search of more fertile territory. And he says the thing is, though, that these people always move towards the civilized areas, and this isn't a coincidence. So it suggests it's not really climate change that's driving them. It is the wealth and opportunity provided by the civilized areas. And precisely how this works out, this search for wealth and opportunity, depends upon the relationship between the civilized and barbarian areas. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so when the civil-barbarian relationship is such that the civilization is vigorous, strong, and advanced compared to the barbarians, so socially advanced and technologically advanced compared to the barbarians, then the barbarian behavior in terms of invasion is to come into the civilization as economic migrants, looking for that wealth and opportunity by working and trading. But when the civil-barbarian relationship is such that the civilization is declining and the barbarians are catching up, then the barbarian behavior is more to go for preferment. So it starts to rise up in prosperity, own land, and have control economic activity, and but particularly more than that, to infiltrate the government structures and rise up in the government, so that for example, in the times of the Roman Empire, many of the governors of districts and the generals in the army were ultimately of barbarian origin. So they seek preferment, but also they come in as armies from the barbarian areas, conquering and imposing their rule on this declining civilization. And because of these twin processes of the infiltration, the barbarian inside the gates, as it were, and the conquest of the barbarian at the gates, these barbarian conquerors are often knocking on an open door. They're conquering something where many of their own kind of people are already in control. And the barbarian invasion then doesn't sort of come out of the blue. It's part of a general logic to do with the evolution of the civilization. So as a civilization goes through its life cycle, the kind of thing looked at by Spengler and Toynbee, so it brings the barbarians into that drama. So let's have a look at sort of the stages in that cycle. So we can say that as the civilization declines, it causes a weakening of global economic and political networks that originally the civilization is at the center of. So a weaker civilization is economically impoverished. It creates less demand for trade, so it reduces economic opportunities for those people surrounding it, the barbarians, who have been trading with it and making money off that trade. So we're seeing a collapse of trade networks beyond the bounds of the civilization that is affecting people beyond the bounds of the civilization. And also, insofar as the civilization was a mighty, powerful empire with a strong military, it tended to impose order, not just within the civilization, but on the people beyond the bounds of its civilization. So it tended to keep the peace in the world at large. But as it's declining, that doesn't happen. So we can say there's a decline in global prosperity and governance, collapsing trade networks, lack of order force in the international system. And the barbarian areas tend to be hardest hit by this. So it's increasingly obvious in the barbarian areas that they're declining into poverty and disorder. And so this leads them to seek refuge in what's left of the civilization, and therefore leads to this invasion and eventual conquest. So initially, responding to poverty and disorder in the barbarian areas by coming in to the civilization to work and to enjoy the remaining order that exists within the civilization, but as it declines further, coming in to conquer it themselves, to plunder what's left of the civilization, and then as military people to impose their own order on it. So barbarians don't just suddenly appear on the horizon. They're constantly in contact with the civilization, and their invasion is all part of this connected process of the evolution of the civilization, particularly in its declining phase. And so we could say that the civilization kind of generates the processes that lead to the barbarian invasion. And so this leads on to the idea that the barbarians are the dark twin of the civilization. Their actions in invading the civilization are kind of part of a duet between the civilization and the barbarians. So let's have a look at this idea of a dark twin. So this is an idea of James C. Scott, and is basically the suggestion that the civilization creates the barbarians that later threaten it. So we have, say, a civilization here, and what characterizes a civilization, civilized life, is laws and taxes. So the orderliness of the civilization and the ability of the civilization to produce monumental architecture and things like that, and roads and public goods. And surrounding the civilization is an area that is not ruled by it. It's not powerful enough to project its authority into there. So this area is autonomous. There's no government here. People are relatively independent, and they're also untaxed. Again, with no government to extract economic surplus from the peasants. And this is then, by definition, the barbarian area. It's the area surrounding the civilization where the civilization's laws and taxes do not apply, and there are no laws and taxes. There's a lack of governance. And so Scott then points out that the difference between them is political rather than cultural. That is, the difference is whether there is an effective political authority. In the civilization, there is an effective political authority. In the barbarian area, there is no effective political authority. It's not to do with difference in values, it's to do with differences in levels of governance. And to say something is barbarian just means it is not controlled by the civilization. And Scott also suggests that it's kind of been neglected, that there is a movement out from the civilization, often into the barbarian areas. It's not the only one way that the barbarians come into the civilization, but people from the civilization escape into the barbarian area in order to get away from the laws and taxes of the civilization. He calls this secondary primitivism. So it's people kind of going off grid, trying to move into areas where they can get away from the control of the civilization. And then he suggests there are several ways in which the civilization causes the barbarians to form into groups that will ultimately attack the civilization. So let's have a look at how civilizations create their own attackers, how they stimulate them into existence, according to Scott. So the first one is that they infringe on the barbarian lands. So the civilization, intrudes into these areas, looking and always taking the more fertile or resource-rich lands because of their greater strength compared to the barbarians. So this firstly creates population pressure because it leaves less for the barbarians to live on, less to go round for them, so there's population pressure. And also it causes the barbarians to militarize themselves for protection from these intrusions of the civilized people. The barbarians militarize for self-protection. And both these things then mean that taken together, it means that the barbarians have incentives for resisting and counter-attacking the civilization because of the population pressure, and also the capacity to do it because they're forced to militarize originally for protection, but then they can go on the offensive with that militarized capacity. And another way in which civilizations sort of create their own attackers is because the civilization is a common enemy. So we saw in an earlier lesson how whether people cooperate or compete with each other depends upon the nature of their interests. If they're shared, if they have a shared interest, then they're likely to cooperate because together they can both achieve their common interest. But if they have opposed interests, then they will compete with each other. Well, in this case, where the civilization is a threat to all these barbarian people out here, who are originally autonomous, they're, everyone's independent, they're not part of any kind of organized society. But as they're being attacked by the civilization, they're developing this shared interest in resisting it. The fact that it's a common enemy for all of them means that they all have that shared interest in opposing this common enemy. So that induces the barbarians to start to cooperate. So as cooperation implies the barbarians become politically organized through this desire to oppose their common enemy. They'll cooperate together, and then that will induce them to submit to some kind of leadership to oppose this enemy. And a third way is that the civilization picks and supports barbarian leaders. So in the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans gave gold and other gifts to certain barbarian leaders, which was firstly to strengthen them by making them richer, so they had more power over their local people, and also as a bribe to them to keep order among those people. So they built up these leaders among the barbarians just in order to have people they could negotiate with and say, look, you control your own people, please, and don't come and attack us Romans. And the same thing happened with the European settlers in America with respect to the American Indians. They supported particular American Indian leaders to so that they had somebody that they could negotiate with and draw up treaties with, to say, you Indians confine yourself to these areas and allow us Europeans to live over here in peace. So they couldn't negotiate with amorphous autonomous barbarians. They had to themselves create a barbarian leadership that they could then deal with, whether it's Rome or in America or elsewhere. So in these ways, Scott says, the civilization stimulates the creation of barbarian confederacies. These autonomous barbarian groups then come together under a particular leadership as a confederacy to raid and attack the civilization. So let's just write that up. So the civilization stimulates the emergence of barbarian confederacies, which then raid and attack the civilization. And Scott says that the corollary of this is that when the civilization collapses, it removes all these factors that create this tendency of the barbarians to cooperate and put themselves under a leader and establish a confederacy. So that as the civilization declines, the confederacy also disappears, or as the civilization collapses, the confederacy collapses. And he gives some examples of that, which I'll just put up in a table. Okay, so here's Scott's list of examples of civilized states that were attacked by particular barbarian confederacies. So a classic one is the Roman Empire attacked by the Huns, Attila the Hun. And the point being that, as we said, the confederacy came into existence to attack the empire, but then as that empire disappeared, the confederacy disappeared equally. And indeed, after Attila the Hun had attacked the Roman Empire in the 5th century, 451, it was not long before the Huns disappeared, but also the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. So they kind of disappeared together. And Scott says this is a repeating pattern. So it happened with the Han, who were attacked by the Xiongnu, and then as the Han disappeared, so did the Xiongnu. The Tang dynasty later attacked by the Turkic Khaganate. As the Tang dynasty came to its end, so did the Khaganate. The Egyptians, the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt, were a confederacy. We know that they, this is why they're called the Sea Peoples. They're made up of various groups that are named in the Egyptian sources for this. And they attacked Egypt, and then at that time, around about 1200 BC, Egypt and many other areas went into a period of disorder and civilizational collapse, or at least regression, and the Sea Peoples disappeared at the same time. And then lastly, Scott has for Mesopotamia, he's not so sure about it, but he suggests perhaps a similar behavior of the Amorites, who are a people from the west of Mesopotamia, from the coastal areas of today's Syria, and who attacked it, but then also seemed to disappear into the history as Mesopotamia itself collapsed.